Great, so I wanted to start by thanking Scott and Alex for putting this conference together as we approach the end of the evening. And I also wanted to thank Rob for getting us started on a really great session, I hope. So I'm going to be talking about the design of public housing allocation. And I wanted to start just by putting up a few what I think of as design questions when it comes to low-income housing policy. So I think Rob did an excellent job of motivating why we care about public housing. But I'm going to briefly comment on affordable housing. So in the US, we think of housing as being affordable if you spend 30% or less of your income on rent. But as you can see here, for low-income households, a substantial fraction of income is spent on rent. Here's a geographical depiction of how many hours you would have to work at the state minimum wage in order to be able to afford a one-bedroom unit. You can see in Illinois, you'd have to work 81 hours a week at the minimum wage. And so that gets into the question of who's going to get housing assistance. We have 21 million households who are eligible for public housing assistance in the sense that they can't afford housing. 11 million households, which is 8% of US households, actually pay more than half of their income as rent. But housing is not an entitlement in the US. And as you can see here, only 1 in 4, as Rob pointed out, households actually receive assistance. You can see that this number is slightly higher for the elderly or for households with disabilities and so forth. And so then the question that arises is what type of assistance can we offer these folks? So there are going to be 2 examples that I discuss in some detail in this talk. One is vouchers, which Rob has done some work on as well. We see that a substantial fraction of vouchers go to households with children, disabilities, the elderly, and so forth. And the same is true for public housing as well. So just to contrast these 2 options that are most commonly available to households in terms of the assistance they receive, 1.2 million people are households are living in public housing, which are units that are owned by the federal government and operated by local public housing authorities. And about 2.3 million receive vouchers. So these are federally subsidized, these are federal subsidies that you can use to go to a private landlord in order to subsidize the portion of your rent that exceeds 30% of your income. Now, as you saw from the graphs that I showed before, households with disabilities and households with elderly members and so forth receive both types of assistance. Some of these can be valuable for different types of people. So if you imagine an elderly household that has difficulty finding a unit, they might find living in public housing where the government is their landlord to be particularly beneficial. Now, one of the options that you didn't see on the slide before was cash assistance. Typically, cash assistance is considered less desirable from taxpayers. Reasons for that include, if we have preferences over what people do with their assistance, that's a justification that's commonly used for in-kind transfers. And in some cases, if we think that children should be the intended recipients of this type of assistance, giving these types of in-kind transfers is often desirable. Now, in terms of receiving vouchers, that's one way of implementing this in-kind transfer. But vouchers often come with an expiration date. You have 3 months to lease up a unit, and if you can't find something, in this article in the Chicago Tribune, we see, "In a blink, all hope was snatched from me." And this article details the stories of several households, there are hundreds of them in fact, who come close to leasing up a unit, but then the unit fails the final inspection because the landlord didn't put in a refrigerator, and they don't get an offer of housing, and their voucher expires. So voucher assistance in some cases is less desirable for certain groups of people. So we have these 2 systems that are often being used, vouchers and public housing, and they have different values to different groups of people. And so the question is, how can we get people to sort into the type of system that's most beneficial for them? These 2 systems are often administered by the same public housing authority. There are 3,300 public housing authorities in the US, and half of them offer both types of programs, but they often administer them completely separately. So if you sign up for the waiting list for vouchers, you get a random number, and that may determine your priority. And the same is true for public housing as well. And you can be on both waiting lists. So if you draw a good number for your lottery for vouchers, then you're effectively randomized into receiving a voucher, even if it's not the most valuable for you, because your independent random draw for your position on the waiting list for public housing is most likely not going to be, there's going to be a long waiting cost associated with that. And so the key design question that I think that emerges from this example is, if we want to maximize this, this match between the value of assistance that people are receiving and their ability to wait for these types of assistance, we need some way to trade these off. And so you could imagine, for example, running a single lottery. And if you get a single lottery number, then you can sort into which program that you find more effective for you. And so that would allow us, I think, to allow people to exhibit their preferences over these different types of assistance and more effectively sort into what they perceive to be more desirable. Now, this is something that's going to feature in the example that I'm going to discuss in more detail, which is where people are assigned. But first, I want to talk about when do people get assistance. So in Chicago, 2 years ago, the public housing waiting lists were open for a period of 1 month, and we've had almost 300,000 people register for public housing. This is after the waiting list was closed for a period of over 4 years. You wait about 3.5 years to get assistance, and finally, when you get to the top of the waiting list, you have the opportunity to select a unit. Once you get a unit, many people stay there for the rest of their lives. So that's a large part of the reason why supply is so scarce here. Even people whose incomes exceed the eligibility guidelines, once they live in public housing, can stay there. And so as a consequence of that, you're essentially waiting for someone to pass away before a unit becomes available. Here's an article that was released the very next day from that statistic where it says now that HUD's trying to get rid of households who earn too much money. And then 2 days later, sorry, the very next day, it's not actually that easy. Now, one of the reasons why HUD has some interest in keeping households who earn a lot of money in these developments is potentially because of these externalities. If we have mixed income communities, there's some benefit to living alongside higher income residents. There are potential spillovers and peer effects, and that's an area where applied microeconomic research can certainly inform some of the design objectives. To what extent do we want integrated mixed income developments, and to what extent do we want to balance that with the objective of providing low income households with assistance? And one of the things that is necessary in this context, of course, is to ration housing, because it's not an entitlement. But we'll see. Winnie's going to discuss how in Europe that's not as much of a constraint. So when you get to the top of the waiting list, the question is, where are you going to get an assignment? Most assignment mechanisms don't provide people with much choice over where they'd like to live. So here's a study from Hong Kong which talks about spatial mismatch. They conclude that private housing residents are more mobile than their public housing counterparts. Conditional on moving from public housing, you're more likely to relocate farther away from your original place of residence, and you're less likely to work near where you live. So here's a map of public housing in the city of Chicago. As you can see, somebody might be working in Uptown, and they might end up getting a place to live in Englewood, and that's really far away. And so one of the key objectives is going to be to make that to prevent something like that from happening. Unfortunately, the existing procedures that are used for assigning public housing make that happen quite frequently. The take it or leave it mechanism is the most common, and it's used here in Chicago. So what that means is once you get to the top of the waiting list, you receive one offer of housing, whatever becomes available. And you have the opportunity to refuse that unit, but if you do so, you get kicked to the bottom of the waiting list, which means you have to wait another 4 years before you get an offer. In some cities, they remove you entirely from the waiting list. Some housing authorities do give people choice by allowing you to decline 1 unit without penalty or 2 units without penalty, and in some cases even 3. But then this difficulty still arises that if it's not suitable for you in terms of location, you're either stuck with something that's a mismatch or you get nothing at all. And so one of the key objectives in terms of redesigning these public housing allocation mechanisms is going to be to give people a way to express choice in the allocation procedure and see where that takes us. Some housing authorities, and I think Winnie's going to comment on this further, use a first come, first served type mechanism where there's no limit to the number of refusals. And so I'll discuss that in some detail as well. So in the paper, what I do is I introduce a new mechanism, an alternative, which allows people to exhibit choice in where they'd like to live. It satisfies a number of desirable properties. It's extremely simple to implement, which I hope we'll see today. And then I quantify welfare gains from changing the allocation mechanism that's used in Pittsburgh, which is take it or leave it, to the new multiple waitlist procedure that I propose. So this matching environment, it's different from the sort of canonical school choice type problems that we often deal with in matching theory, because objects are allocated as they arrive over time. It's not the case that we have everyone there in the market at the same time and all the units there at the same time to match them with each other. And in particular, there's uncertainty about whether objects are available, and agents have preferences over waiting times. And so one of the key objectives that we often face in market design is designing strategy proof mechanisms. Of course, one of the reasons for this is fairness. If some agents have more information or are more sophisticated, we don't want them to have an advantage in these assignment procedures. There are other justifications, and I think one important one that arises in this context is information. If we're a housing authority or a social planner, it's important to elicit information, truthful preferences about where people would like to live, so that we know where to invest in creating more developments and so forth. And so, some of the legal scholars that have talked about public housing emphasize a fairness condition, which I think can be formalized as eliminating justified envy, in the sense that if you prefer the assignment of someone, that person should not have lower priority than you. And of course, we have notions like Pareto efficiency that I think we're pretty familiar with in terms of doing market design. But one of the, I think, key aspects of trying to define these concepts in this problem is the fact that there is some dynamic aspect to it. And so the perspective that I'm going to take for the rest of this talk is the time period at which someone receives an assignment. And so the reason that I make that caveat about the timing of when these properties should be evaluated is that ex post, it's impossible to achieve a Pareto efficient or an envy-free allocation. This is a problem where units are arriving stochastically over time. You need that type of matching model in order to evaluate misallocation of public housing. And certainly with stochastic arrival, essentially the realization of the arrival process can be such that anything can happen. And so one of the key results, which is rather straightforward to show, is that there is a mechanism that satisfies all these properties, and I'm going to exhibit that mechanism right now. So the multiple waitlist procedure, we have a set of waiting lists. We have a centralized waiting list, and then we have a number of site-specific waiting lists, one for each building you can think of. And so all applicants are going to start on this centralized waiting list, and once you get to the top of this waiting list, once a unit becomes available, you make an offer to whomever is at the front of the site-specific waiting list for that unit. So if we have 3 units, A, B, and C, and the queue for unit A is empty and a unit A arrives, then we can offer to the agent on the centralized waiting list. Now they have the opportunity to decline this offer. And if they do so, they need to specify to you which building they'd like to wait for instead, and they join a first in, first out waiting list for that particular building. So essentially what we do in this mechanism is we give agents an opportunity to decline a unit, and when they do so, they choose a waiting list to join. So we're allocating units that have not yet arrived, and in particular, we're allocating positions on waiting lists. This enables people to trade off their preferences for units with their preferences for waiting times. Now, this is a very simple stylized framework, but you can show that a number of realistic features of the public housing market can be accommodated. For example, if priority orderings are changing over time, or agents are arriving to the system, or if we have unobserved heterogeneity in preferences, then once we adjust people's expectations about the arrival processes, these theoretical results that I've briefly described still go through. But the key question, I think, for practice is whether something like this would be good in practice, whether ex post welfare gains are substantial. Jed?
Sorry, before you get to ex post,
Yeah.
just want to make sure I understand so ex ante, it's strategy proof, assuming agents know when they wait. So for the multiple buildings waiting lists, I know the wait time and building information, and I'm deciding which bundle of wait time buildings.
Absolutely. So it's key that people have information when they're making this choice about what the expected waiting times are for the different units. And so you're facing a choice between, do I want to take the offer that I'm given today for building A, or do I want to join a waiting list for building B, which is expected to arrive in 2 months, or join a waiting list for building C, which is expected to arrive in 3 months. And if people's preferences are sufficiently strong for building C, then perhaps they join the waiting list. So it enables people to express that trade-off between waiting time and building preferences.
So then you have this issue of how sophisticated are the agents about the expected waiting time, the variance of waiting time.
That's right. So
normally I can try to prove, I think I just all I have to know is my preferences.
Mm-hmm.
But my
So
preferences here are sort of a combination of my preferences and this understanding this information.
right. So housing authorities do have information about the arrival process. They have historical data, and these things in principle can be released. There are papers that take this observational data and estimate waiting times. And so in practice, certainly that would be important for people to have that information. That's absolutely crucial as a detail for this market to function. And so the question then that we turn to is ex post, whether the welfare gains from changing the matching mechanism would be substantial. And so in order to answer this question, we use a structural model of preferences for public housing from Judy Gayer and Holger Sieg's work, using data from the SIP with a sample of low-income households who are eligible for public housing assistance in Pittsburgh. And the goal is going to be to quantify these welfare gains. We're going to simulate various arrival processes, estimating that using the data from the Housing Authority of the City of Pittsburgh. And we're going to simulate allocations under various mechanisms. One caveat that I wanted to put forth is with regards to this first come, first serve mechanism. The state space for simulating that is exponential, and it's a sort of technical detail. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to compute an upper bound for welfare under that by making some very generous assumptions, by assuming that people have perfect foresight over the arrival process and complete information about the preferences of other households. There is empirical work by Van Omeren and van der Vlist in the Journal of Urban Economics, which shows that this type of allocation procedure induces an inefficient matching between apartments and households. And so with that caveat aside, I'm going to turn to the welfare measure that I use, which is the equivalent variation. It's what transfer would you have to give households under the old assignment mechanism to make them indifferent between that procedure and the new procedure that I proposed. And it turns out that the welfare gains are quite substantial. They're on the order of $6,500 per applicant for changing the mechanism to the multiple waitlist procedure that I've proposed. As a benchmark, just increasing choice by allowing people to have one opportunity to decline a unit already gets you 60% of the way there. And as we can see, MWP pushes you to that 6,400 number. As a further benchmark, the last row in the table tells you what the ex post welfare gain would be under this idealized benchmark, where you know everything about the allocation procedure in advance. So if you have a social planner who knows everything perfectly, what's going to arrive, and they know everyone's preferences, they can perfectly match people with apartments. And that would achieve an $8,500 welfare gain according to the simulations. And so MWP achieves 75% of that bound. So we get 75% of this unattainable but idealized benchmark. Now, just to put that number into some perspective, that's a daily transfer payment of $9 at this discount rate, and that's working 105 minutes at the minimum hourly wage a day. So that's, people spend 83 minutes commuting in public transit or 46 minutes commuting by car. So this is quite a substantial welfare gain for a fraction of the population that's in need of assistance. And so what I wanted to spend the last couple of minutes commenting on is what sort of future directions we can go with. And what sort of lessons we can learn from this type of allocation problem for market design. And the first thing that I wanted to comment on is this idea of trading off preferences for different services and waiting time. So in terms of building assignment, that's crucial, and that's what I focused on in the paper that I presented. But of course, it also applies to different social, different services like vouchers versus public housing. The key idea being that when people have different waiting times, we can allow them to sort into what form of assistance they consider to be the most valuable to them. And as a consequence of that, you can elicit people's valuations for what type of service would be most effective for them. The other, I think, important aspect of this is that we want to optimize things jointly rather than separately. I think this also came up yesterday in Parag's work. We were talking about optimizing neighborhood choice along with school choice. If you think about welfare programs in general, one thing I haven't commented on since I've just been focusing on housing assistance is that there are a whole host of other transfer programs like TANF and SNAP, which are also intended to serve the low-income population. And so to the extent that these other services also have complementarities, and also their eligibility guidelines are completely separate from each other, that's sort of an important avenue for considering future work that affects these groups. And finally, what I wanted to comment on is something that Scott mentioned in his brilliant impromptu discussion yesterday, which is the ways in which we can integrate microeconomic research or applied microeconomic research with market design. And so, I'm going to give a specific example to close. When we talk about the question of what to do with these over-income households that still haven't left public housing, imagine you're making more than the income threshold and you're still living in public housing. The question is, what are the spillovers and externalities that are generated by that household on their peers, and whether it's beneficial or desirable to have them there. So that's certainly a question that we can answer using applied microeconomic research, and that would inform sort of what the inequality objectives are and what the design objectives are. So when we're trying to design low-income housing policy, we need to know whether that would inform our decision of whether we'd want to restrict eligibility guidelines or put a time limit on assistance and so forth. But it also goes the other way, and this is something really important that I wanted to highlight to sort of complement that discussion that started off yesterday, which is that the allocation mechanism itself has an important impact on trying to evaluate these applied microeconomic programs. So to take a case in point, think about the MTO experiment, I think that Rob briefly mentioned. When we're thinking about taking households out of public housing and giving them vouchers to have them move to better neighborhoods, there are some impacts that have been demonstrated on children and their later life long-term outcomes. But that's relative to a baseline evaluation mechanism, which was essentially random, where people had no choice in where they'd like to be assigned. And so, one of the ways in which, taking into account market design can inform those sort of applied micro-type studies is to say, well, how much of that gain could we achieve just by, redesigning the public housing allocation system, and then to what extent does vouchers improve on top of that? And so that's where I wanted to leave off and give the floor to Winnie to finish up.